Hi, welcome to my Vlog 1 Skills and Capacities in the Weight Room for the module Practical Techniques in Strength and Conditioning. Before analysing any gym footage, I'm going to share my beliefs on what separates skills and capacities. The first element of movement I focus on is the athlete's underpinning motor skill. I mainly work with youth athletes, and 9 out of 10 times any movement issues are due to the athlete not having performed the movement before. Another skill limiting factor I come across often is coordination challenges, such as growth and physical changes occurring within the athlete. These changes can impact on both the movement aesthetics and also the movement outcome. And lastly, the third skill factor I consider is inexperience or unfamiliarity. There are times with my athletes where I know that they have the movement solutions to complete an exercise, but because there is a change in the equipment or environment, they find it difficult to perform the movement. Moving on to capacities. For me, skills and capacities can go hand in hand with the reason to why an athlete can or cannot perform an exercise. I would categorise the following as capacity-based limitations. The first capacity-based limitation is the athlete's ability to produce force and achieve the desired movement. Very simply, if the load is too heavy or the speed of the movement is too quick, the athlete is going to fail on some element of the movement. The second capacity limitation I consider is the range that the athlete is able to achieve. Working in football, I often come across players that have limited ranges of movement due to the way that their muscles have developed from playing the sport. Finally, the last capacity limitation I experience throughout my job is fatigue. When players perform movements after a tough training session or towards the end of a heavy set, movements often change to complete the exercise and avoid using muscles that are fatigued. Before I move on to the movement analysis, let me introduce my athletes. In this vlog, I am utilising the help of Dan and Jamie. Both of these guys play university football and are aged 20 to 21. In this vlog, I'm going to look at the back squat from both of my athletes, an RDL from Dan and a push press from Jamie. Let's get started with Dan's back squat. The back squat is a bilateral compound movement that requires coordination from multiple joints across the athlete. In this demonstration by Dan, I'm going to focus on the 4 locations to begin with: the shoulder, hip, knee and ankle. Due to the horizontal position of the bar during the back squat, centre of gravity should always be maintained over the mid-foot. In order to achieve this, it is important that flexion of the hip and knee is aligned with dorsiflexion of the ankle. In Dan's back squat, there are 2 potential capacity limitations causing some undesired movement outcomes. If I freeze the image at the bottom position of the squat, it is clear that there is a difference in the angle between the trunk and the shank. This looks to be due to a lack of dorsiflexion and an excessive forward lean on the downward phase. Let's take a look at this movement during the downward phase. Firstly, Dan initiates the movement with his hips. As we can see from the still image, this creates an early difference between the trunk and shank angle. This may impact on Dan's centre of mass during the lift, causing him to lose balance, and it may also create a more hip-dominant exercise, taking away from the intended desire of the exercise in the first place of an equal emphasis on both the posterior and anterior lower limb muscles. Then, at the bottom position, Dan has a far greater hip flexion compared with the knee. This will result in the glutes and other posterior hip muscles being at a more lengthened state than the anterior quad muscles and required to do more of the work during the upward phase. Here is a snapshot of Dan during the downward phase to highlight the changes of angle in the trunk and the shank. As you can see in the third image, the angle change of the trunk is a lot greater at approximately 60 degrees, whereas the shank is altered at only around 20 degrees. So far, I would argue that the movement deficiencies in Dan's squat are capacity-based, more specifically due to poor mobility in the ankle joint. When investigating this theory, it turned out that Dan performed a lot of his gym program with the weight in front of his body, as shown here. This would therefore mean that he is used to a squat being more hip dominant and the centre of mass being in front of him, and this may be why he has restricted ankle mobility. From performing a simple knee to wall test, it was evident that this is an area that is limiting Dan's squat performance. When looking at the front angle of Dan's squat, it offers further support to Dan's limited dorsiflexion. He lacks the ability to maintain his heels on the floor when in the bottom position. A common cue used on the foot during the squat is to imagine that it is a tripod, the 3 points of contact being the big toe, little toe and heel. This is something that could support Dan in keeping his heel on the floor. This front position allows me to analyse other aspects of Dan's squat. He has a good foot setup with a slight outward rotation of the lower leg and foot width wider than the hips. This creates a hole for him to drop into during the squat movement. His knee to toe alignment is good, suggesting that his posterior strength is sufficient to avoid any valgus or internal rotation of the femur. Finally, his elbow and hand position have created a strong support setup to keep control of the bar. To work on Dan's ability to maintain an upright trunk angle and subsequently achieve a greater dorsiflexion, I would use a constraints-based approach. In this task, the athlete has an external constraint that provides feedback to whether the movement is being done correctly or not. If the cup falls off the head, the trunk angle is probably too far forward. This method offers a guided discovery for the athlete to find a movement solution. Cues could be added such as imagine you're sitting on a chair, or make sure the person in front of you can see the logo on your chest. Now let's focus on the back squat by Jamie. Straight away I noticed two things from Jamie's back squat. He doesn't reach parallel with his femur and his head is constantly moving to look at his positions. When we freeze the frame at the bottom position, it is clear that he isn't aware of the depth required for the movement. As the repetitions continue, he's looking around and trying to work out where he is and where he should be. This is due to his lack of experience performing the squat movement. For Jamie to understand the squat movement, I regressed the exercise to a goblet squat. This is also a new movement for Jamie, but due to the reduced load, it is a safer introduction into squatting. This reduction of load becomes vital when looking at Jamie from side on. As we can see here, there is a noticeable flexion of the lumbar spine at the bottom position of the squat. When we look at this freeze frame comparison, it is noticeable how the hips roll under at the bottom. Due to his inexperience in this low squat position, Jamie has solved the movement through the incorrect solution. He has flexed the lumbar spine to get depth, whereas he could have dorsiflexed greater to keep the upright trunk position. A simple movement task that Jamie could utilise is the one demonstrated here. Using a box or a chair as the bottom position of the squat will allow Jamie to gain an understanding of his hip position and maintain a better trunk position on the descent. The RDL or Romanian deadlift is a posterior strength exercise that targets the hamstring muscles through hip flexion. On the setup of the RDL, Dan demonstrates good soft knees as highlighted, but does show signs of an anterior pelvic tilt and slight lumbar lordosis. As Dan hinges to the bottom of the RDL, two things become apparent. Firstly, the curvature of the spine is still present, and secondly, he is only able to reach his knees when fully flexed at the hip. My suggestion at this point would be that the combination of the extended spine and the anterior pelvic tilt are causing a lack of flexibility in the hamstring muscles, and this is why Dan cannot reach past his knees. Apart from the few capacity issues I have highlighted with Dan's mobility and flexibility, his understanding of the movement is excellent. As we can see in this freeze frame, he is able to initiate the movement at the hip by pushing the hip backwards and maintain a soft knee stance. The bar path is good also, travelling in a downward vertical motion close to the surface of the leg. This keeps the centre of mass in the midpoint of the body. And although I have suggested that there are some issues with the back extension, it is a positive thing that he is able to maintain a strong back position and avoid any flexion. My first action with Dan would be to address the anterior pelvic tilt issue and see if that impacts on the range achieved during the RDL. This 4-point leg extension is a way of getting your athlete to consciously feel what position their pelvis is in. Using a stick on the surface of the back helps with feedback to the athlete. To regress this, you can manipulate the leg movement to smaller ranges or different directions. A common cue to rotate the pelvis backwards is by imagining there's a piece of string on your belly button and you're pulling it up towards your face. The final movement I'm going to look at is the push press. This movement was completely new to my athlete, and as you can see from the footage, he can't quite grasp the coordination across the multiple joints. This movement involves utilizing the stretch shortening cycle by flexing at the ankle, knee and hip, followed by a rapid triple extension of the three. At the end of this triple extension, the bar should travel vertically upwards above the crown of the head. My athlete, however, is struggling to coordinate these four things. Starting from the bottom, he doesn't plan to flex at the ankle at all. Secondly, he does show some signs of knee flexion and extension, but he then fails to flex and extend at the hips, but instead extends his back to produce some momentum to get the bar up. When speaking to my athlete, he also expressed worries of hitting himself in the face with the bar, and this could be impacting his back extension and lack of hip movement. To help him break down the movement, I took away any load and utilised the wall for him to reach back to with his hips to ensure hip flexion. To help with the rapid triple extension, we also used explosive vertical throws, and I used cues such as imagine you're a tight spring or a rocket about to explode. As previously mentioned, I believe there is a strong link between skill and capacity, and ultimately one leads to the other, both for the good and for the bad.